January has gotten off to a good start reading-wise. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to what I hope is a pretty quick wrap-up of the first 5 books I've read so far in January. I think we're somewhere around January the 11th today, so I'm not doing too bad in terms of my reading pace, and I've had an enjoyable time reading some books. One of these books is a book I think we actually began reading in December, so it's a bit of a carryover. But the first book that I read and completed this month was Taste by Stanley Tucci. This is the first book by Stanley Tucci I've read. Stanley Tucci is one of my favorite celebrities. Seems like a nice person, really interesting person, really interested in food. And this is kind of a memoir of his relationship with food from childhood to adulthood. It covers aspects of his family life and some personal tragedies that took place in his life. I thought it was a really compelling and not egregious or self-serving way, including the death of his first wife and his battle with, I believe, throat or tongue cancer, which really, obviously was a serious health threat to him, but it also really affected his relationship with food, and that's ongoing. And he's just an interesting, funny guy. One of the best things about this book is it also includes some recipes. It has a sense of humor. Since I am a person with inner monologue, when I was reading it, I heard Stanley Tucci's voice, or my brain's approximation of Stanley Tucci's voice the whole time I was reading it. And I just thought it was really interesting and really compelling and a really good read. And I'm going to be reading his second book, or the next book of his I have, which I also got for Christmas. By the way, this is a Christmas gift from my daughter. Second book I got is also going to be kind of like, I can't remember the title of it exactly. Maybe I'll put a picture of it up here. But it's essentially a diary of what he ate every day and his relationship to that, which I thought think is going to be really interesting as well. The second book I completed this month, I think, was Thursday Night Widows, which is a novel by Argentinian crime writer, primarily Claudia Pineiro. I'm a part of the Pineiro reading group, which meets on Voxer every so often when we finish a book. So far I think they've read 3 Claudia Pineiro books, or I've read 3 Claudia Pineiro books. The first was All Yours, the second was Time of Flies, and the third was Thursday Night Widows. This is, I believe, Pineiro's first published novel, even though it wasn't the first one of her novels I think to be published in the United States. And I liked All Yours, and I really liked Time of Flies. I'm not sure I reviewed either one of those books on my channel, but I like both of those books. Time of Flies probably might be my favorite Pineiro of all the books I've read, of those 4 books now that I've read by her. And of the 4 books I've read by her, Thursday Night Widows is probably my least favorite. It feels like a book that a really ambitious writer would write as their first book. One of the things I think is common with a lot of first-time novelists or a problem they may have, or something they have to fight, maybe that's a better way of looking at it, is trying to get all their ideas into that one book because you're not sure you're going to get another book deal maybe. And this feels like that. It's set in a community of affluent people who live outside of Buenos Aires in this kind of suburban community, which I think is called the Cascades. It might have a little bit more to the name, but essentially it is like this closed community. It's literally surrounded by a wall. There are guards outside. And so inside what we get is this kind of closed community of wealthy people. And we see the interaction of several, in my opinion, too many characters and the relationship with their wives and husbands. A few of their children are brought in. And we see this kind of, I think what Pineiro was attempting to do was kind of create or recreate perhaps what would have been the affluent ruling class of Argentina at a certain point in time, and all the problems they had, particularly with changes that were coming to Argentina, perhaps with less investment from Western corporations, leading to unemployment among these formerly wealthy, economically powerful men, more of their wives having to go to work, the stress that puts on the relationship, and then how it reflects, or how the events that take place in the book, I think, reflect the patriarchy, which I think is oftentimes something that Pineiro is writing about, reflect the patriarchy of Argentina, the way it affects women in terms of violence against women, trigger warnings there, in terms of, unhappy relationships, but also how it affects men in terms of this kind of loss of masculinity, which I think the male characters of the book try to replace with sports like golf and tennis and things like that. There is a mystery at the heart of it, of the book. One of my complaints about the book was, it starts off as this kind of mystery of how this kind of, obviously there's some deaths involved, how these deaths happen, or why these deaths happen. And then it introduces the book that way, and then it goes to this incredibly long period, which is just kind of talking about all these characters and relationships with their spouses and their relationship with one another, and then finally it gets back to kind of the mystery element of the book at the end. I just didn't think it worked all that well. I thought it was a little bit too much, too many characters, too many relationships to keep up. I mean, when we are talking about at the heart of the book, there are 4 couples. And 2 or 3 kids, but there are also secondary couples who play a role in the book from point to point, and it really was a lot to keep up with. In addition to that, Pineiro kind of changes the POV, first person to third person close, to then this almost like voice that's like the community itself, which is relaying its stories. So I didn't think it was all that successful. Not a bad book, but not a really good book. And I think I said in the group that if this had been the first Pineiro book I read, I'm not sure I would have finished it, and if we weren't in the group, I'm not sure I would have finished it. I'm not sure I would have read any more Pineiro. We are reading Elena Knows coming up, I believe, beginning this week. So the third book that I finished this month was Margaret Pinard, BookTube's own Margaret Pinard's new book, Orla Rafferty Seeks Her Fortune. This is a book set in, I believe, 1830 Scotland. The time period is actually important, because, and I'm sorry that I don't know exactly, the time period is actually important because the events that are taking place are related, or the historical events taking place affect our main character, Orla Rafferty. Orla Rafferty is a woman who has recently been widowed. Her husband was an Anglican clergyman, and she's been widowed, and so she's essentially facing how to navigate life essentially on her own. And what we see is her kind of go through these adventures, which are largely social and financial adventures. Her husband's left her with enough money and an income and a place to live, which should last her the rest of her life as long as her investments stay solid. She runs into trouble there. She has to reassess. She has to retrench her investments. She becomes more and more socially aware. She becomes more and more socially active. She finds herself involved in a scandal of financial sense, which she somewhat regrets, but at the other times, feels like this is a real motivation for her life to get involved and do things to help the poor, to be an advocate for the ending of British Empire support for slavery and profit from slavery. And there's a whole lot of historical detail wrapped up in this. Oh, and on top of that, she has to kind of reunite with her family who disowned her when she left Catholicism to marry this Anglican clergyman. And so there's a lot going on. And the thing I think is, and I said this about the other book by Margaret I read, Margaret's historical fiction wears its research fairly lightly. One of the problems I think I find oftentimes with historical fiction is the writer has this need is interested in doing the research, interested in the past. And so you gather all these details and all these kind of things, and they feel like they have to put them all in there. And sometimes it's not done very well. So you go, okay, well, here's the historical research this person's done, and that's why they're telling me. I didn't get that sense with Orla Rafferty. I'll be honest with you, I, from time to time, had a little bit of hard time following the economic situation of that period of time and that place in the world, but it doesn't detract from the story that I didn't remember or necessarily understand every single detail. I think that's my fault and not Margaret's fault. But Orla is an engaging character, an interesting character, and this is the first book in Margaret's new series, which is called The Widening Gyre, and I'm looking forward to the next. So the fourth book I read this month was a book that was sent to me through MJ and is published by the publisher of my book, Casemate Publishers, and that book is The Valhalla Boys. Now I'm going to do a full review of this book, which should go up on the day the book is released, which is January the 15th, so it's coming up really soon. This is The Valhalla Boys, Marine Recon Sniper in Iraq by Brennan Morton. This may seem like a departure from what I normally read, but if you watch my channel for a long time, you know that military history, or fiction set during World War I, World War II, Vietnam, written particularly by veterans, is something that I really have an interest in. It's kind of one of my first real academic interests. And I like I like these stories, and so I'm going to be doing a full review of this later, but I'll just say right up front, this is a well-written, really compelling book, which I hope a lot of people read. And then the last book I read so far this month is my latest Percival Everett novel, and that is I Am Not Sidney Portier. So Percival Everett is my new favorite writer. There's no doubt about that. I've been reading his books in kind of big, rapid gulps for a long time. James, my book of the year. This year, The Trees, I believe, was my number one or two book from a year ago. I loved Erasure. Loved also Telephone. I've been working my way through his books, and I bought a copy of I'm Not Sidney Portier before Christmas, and I just got around to reading it. One of the things I think is kind of challenging as someone who wants to read and really interested in Everett's work is that I'm never exactly sure what Everett's point is. And so what I'm going to always tell you is what I think it is. So our main character, his name is not Sidney Portier. That's his name. His name is literally not Sidney Portier. So not is a part of his first name. Okay? And that, of course, plays a really important role because not only is his name not Sidney Portier, but the older he gets, the more he comes to resemble Sidney Portier. And one of the things I think is charming and fun about Everett's work is that, for being an academic, for being a writer who's written, literally dozens of books and who has a whole lot of interest, if you know anything about Percival Everett, fly fishing, horses, painting, poetry, writing. He's a college professor. I'm sure there are things in there I've left out. But he also has a real kind of affinity for, I think, pop culture things. And so in this book, his character, not Sidney Portier, finds himself in situations which resemble or follow the plots of Sidney Portier movies. In the Heat of the Night, Look Who's Coming to Dinner, The Defiant Ones with Tony Curtis plays a big role here. Buck and the Preacher, I believe, is another one. And I'm sure that I didn't look up all the movie connections. Blackboard Jungle is represented here. Percival Everett himself, which is not all that unusual, makes a little appearance here as a character in this book. And it just really was really interesting and fun in all the ways in which Percival Everett can kind of weave the story of this young man in with these kind of plots which are altered and changed to fit this young man's story of all those movies. In addition to that, not Sidney Portier is born to a single mother living in Los Angeles in a not very particularly neighborhood. He has a really rough childhood in part because of his name. But he inherits a lot of money, and essentially his guardian after his mother dies is Ted Turner. Like Ted Turner started TBS, CNN. And so Ted Turner is represented here as a character in what I think is a really funny way, along with Jane Fonda also kind of plays a role here. So, if you're from the 80s, there's a lot of kind of pop culture things here as well. But what I think Everett is doing here is he is I think hinting at, describing, creating or forcing us to recognize the commonality of the black experience in the United States of America. Sidney Portier has been held up as this kind of icon in the black community for a long period of time. A black man who, nominated for Oscars, appeared in a lot of really important movies alongside really important white actors. From Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy and Look Who's Coming to Dinner, and Tony Curtis in Defiant Ones, and I'm sure I'm forgetting all kinds of other actors that he appeared alongside of. And as such, he was an icon of the black community in the 60s, 70s, all the way through the 80s. And so I think there's this idea that that icon status may have caused him to be treated differently and be seen differently than a black man. Well, not Sidney Portier finds out that's not true. Having money and looking like Sidney Portier doesn't prevent him from being the victim of some really virulent racist things. Oh, the Lilies of Field also here. And so I think that's a really interesting statement. I'm not exactly sure what Everett wants us to draw from the conclusion, which involves the identity of not Sidney Portier or Sidney Portier. Anyway, but it really was interesting. And as is true with most of Everett's books, there are jokes, there's funny things in here, there's wordplay, there's kind of clever dialogue, and it just really was a really enjoyable book. Anyway, there you go. There are the first 5 books that I read in January. Hoping to start on some new books here starting today. If you've read any of these books, have any thoughts about anything that I've said here, please leave those in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching.